I'm Venetia Rainey, and this is Battle Lines. On this bonus episode, I speak to journalist Peter Schwartzstein about his new book, The Heat and the Fury, on the front lines of climate violence. He spent the last decade reporting from about 30 countries on the intersection between climate change and security, meeting pirates, soldiers, and spies along the way. It's a link that isn't spoken about much, and Peter wants to change that. Here's our chat. Welcome to the podcast, Pete. I want to just start by drilling in on this term climate violence. I think a lot of our listeners won't have heard it before. What do you mean by that?
Climate-related violence is sort of looking at the many different ways in which climate stresses are contributing, and contributing is an important word here, but contributing to violence in its many different forms. Now, the reason why I perhaps use the word violence rather than conflict, the term that is more frequently used, is that a lot of my focus is on these kind of smaller, less sexy, kind of nittier and grittier forms of violence, like crime, clashes between individuals, rather than just sort of tensions between nation states. But really, to go back to your original question, it's just exploring the kind of gamut of ways in which climate change is just contributing to a kind of messier, more violent world.
And so is that why you chose, the title of your book is The Heat and the Fury. Why did you think it was important to link climate and conflict, violence, security tensions in this way?
It felt to me that this was a kind of extremely in-your-face manifestation of climate change, arguably the most in-your-face manifestation of climate change, but one that was not particularly well understood, certainly by the average man or woman on the street, but also by, up to a point, kind of many of those within the wider climate world. And part of that, and perhaps we'll get into this, is because of the very complex ways in which climate and violence fit together. It's not a straightforward kind of super linear relationship, but also because, I mean, there's just so many problems, there's so much conflict, there's so many other challenges across the world that, particularly at a time like now, it can be hard for some sort of slightly more nebulous forms of violence to get a look in. So partly this is just trying to elevate a form of kind of climate fallout that is not attracting the kind of attention that its severity warrants. But it's also just trying to explore that little bit more, a kind of form of violence that even many of my peers, I think, would admit is not understood in the ways that it should be.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the examples. In the blurb for the book, it talks about you being chased by kidnappers, detained by police, and told that you're no longer welcome in certain countries. What happened?
The book is not about me, though I do sort of litter it with my own experiences, just to try and maybe humanize some of these experiences a little bit. I did have a kind of very complicated time, particularly when working a lot in Iraq and Syria in 2014, 15, 16, gathering a lot of this material. I mean, at a time when ISIS and various other sort of non-state armed groups were running rampant, I sometimes felt borderline ridiculous kind of asking about environment and climate related problems when so many of our journalistic peers were focused on covering the nature of the conflict itself. I felt that it was only by working within the kind of afflicted areas that one could actually unravel the nature of this relationship. And so a lot of the most important and compelling and interesting interviews that I did were with captured ISIS fighters. They were with kind of Iraqi and Syrian Kurdish and Iraqi Kurdish troops on their respective front lines, many of whom were engaged in conflicts that perhaps, as we'll get into, had a pretty definitive climate angle. So the book is the kind of consequence of about 11 or 12 years worth of kind of climate related reporting from, I think, about 30 something countries, many of which are complicated places to work. And particularly in my kind of younger, dumber years, got a little bit lucky to emerge in one piece.
I guess that's part of the issue, isn't it? That climate change will never be a top priority for reporters in conflict zones or places where there are security issues. So it does take a journalist like yourself, who's been working on this issue for, as you say, over a decade, to step back and think, actually, there are links worth exploring and questions worth asking, even if people on the ground might think it's a bit ridiculous. Let's talk about ISIS and how they use drought as a recruiting tool. Tell me about some of the reporting you did and what you found about the link between climate and violence.
Absolutely. So from about 2014 through to about 2017, over, I think, about a dozen trips to different parts of Iraq and Syria, I was working in liberated parts of these countries, areas that had sort of recently been cleared of ISIS fighters, interviewing security figures, interviewing various villagers, both those that had fled the group's advance and also those who had stayed behind, as well as people who had fought with the jihadis, to try and work out the ways in which collapsing agricultural conditions had contributed to ISIS recruitment. And I found that there was an extremely clear-cut correlation. So in villages, almost all of which were wholly dependent on agriculture, the only economic game in town, the ones that had the worst water access almost invariably yielded many more fighters. Now, I would visit many similar-ish villages that had seemingly equal-ish levels of economic prosperity in the years leading up to the kind of drought that paralyzed much of the region from about 2008 onwards. And almost all of these villages had very similar religious profiles. Almost all of them had few distinguishing factors from the ones that had proven real kind of bonanza recruiting grounds for ISIS. And yet I found that those that had supplementary sources of irrigation, in other words, they had deep bore wells or they had access to irrigation canals and consequently were not dependent on these kind of weakening and failing rains alone, produced on average something like 60 to 70 or even 80% fewer ISIS fighters. Now, we know that kind of immiseration alone, we know that kind of poverty is not a clear-cut contributor to kind of radicalism or jihadism or kind of extremely awful forms of behavior in other forms. However, that kind of desperation, particularly when you had ISIS recruiters dangling the kinds of salaries that these kind of broke, desperate farmers could otherwise only dream of, certainly played a part in that recruiting success.
There's been a lot of debate over the years about the Syrian civil war, and some people initially proposed a theory that climate change was one of the big things fueling it. What do you think about that argument?
The kind of Syria climate conflict case study has sort of inspired such controversy that it's actually come to sort of suck a lot of the oxygen out of the kind of climate security room over the years. And that's partly because back in the early years of the war, you did have some sensationalist, not superbly done reporting that tried to make a little bit too much of the climate angle in contributing to the initial hostilities. But that in turn then led to excessive blowback, whereby you had a number of academics and Syrian activists and others who then went too far in dismissing the climate angle. Now, there's a lot of good reasons for that, one of which is that the Assad regime, as with various other authoritarian governments elsewhere, found this particular climate narrative quite attractive. It's a kind of useful foil for their own failures. It's a kind of force that's largely beyond their power to control. And so many Syrians, extremely understandably, along with their allies elsewhere, saw this narrative as helping the regime and others of their ilk globally to get off the hook. However, as I and a number of others have found in the work that we've done within Syria over the course of the last decade and a bit, climate did indeed play an angle. And this actually goes to the heart of climate change's sort of broader contribution to violence. And that's that a lot of the time, climate is amplifying existing weaknesses in a society. So, for example, if, as in Syria's case, you have prolific corruption, climate change will make people, in this instance, that little bit less tolerant or that little bit less accepting of corruption. So, for example, in the northeast of the country, where I interviewed, I think, well over 100 farmers, many of them would tell me that they'd got extremely used over the past decades to Syrian agricultural officials from the government kind of lacing their seeds with sawdust in order to sell on a bunch of these inputs that are theoretically provided for free onto the private market. However, at a time when you had this kind of intense, seemingly never-ending climate-induced drought, many farmers' capacity to deal with that corruption was much reduced because they had these kind of additional challenges coming their way. So in a Syrian context and a global one, it's climate change amplifying whatever the kind of existing sources of public unhappiness are, whether it's inequality, whether it's corruption, whether it's prolific state mismanagement, whether it's brutality. This is just applying additional troubles that people are not well placed or in many instances willing to contend with.
Let's talk about pirates. What was your reporting in Bangladesh about?
So this was I probably reverted into sort of slightly childish excitement mode when I was given the possibility to report on anything pirate related. And yet many others before me have long since realized there's absolutely nothing cuddly about these people. The term pirate ends up becoming a bit of a misnomer. They're basically just waterborne murderers and thieves and kidnappers. But I was working in the kind of coastal waterways of the Sundarbans in Bangladesh back in about 2015, 2016. I'd been sent there on a Nat Geo assignment. And one of my interviewees mentioned in passing that he had been unable to rebuild his house after a recent cyclone had destroyed it because he'd been kidnapped by pirates on 3 occasions over the course of the previous 2 years. And as a consequence, he was flat broke, deeply in debt to various loan sharks. And my ears all of a sudden perked up. I mean, here was this sort of fascinating sounding tale. And then over the course of, the rest of that reporting trip, when I was really meant to be focusing on other things, and subsequent trips, found that you have this absolutely enormous problem which afflicts tens and tens of thousands of farmers and fishermen. And basically what's happening is that as sea level rise and various other climate and non-climate environmental shocks pitch a lot of these kind of coastal farmers off their land, many of them are turning to what is basically the only alternative viable livelihood in the area, which is fishing. But fishing takes them out into these kind of criminal infested waters. And the more fishermen there are, the more lucrative, the more profitable it is for these pirate gangs, which have, on a lower level at least, made a living, kidnapping for ransom, whatever kind of unfortunate folks happen to cross their path. But the greater the riches on offer, on account of these kind of climate-induced displacements of farmers, the more pirates there are. And because so many of these people who are being kidnapped are these sort of poor, very politically unconnected villagers in a kind of peripheral part of the country, the government hasn't much cared for their plight over the years. And these pirates are not dumb. They're aware that kind of obviously foreign folks like me must be spared, so to speak, for want of attracting the kinds of attention that they don't want to bring down upon themselves. Well-dressed Bangladeshi tourists, scientific researchers, many of whom kind of visit these kind of mangrove swamps in order to get a sense of the impact of climate change. These folks are untouched. It's the kind of obviously impoverished and defenseless sort of local fishermen and honey collectors who were targeted instead.
Did you see any pirates?
I interviewed 2 ex-pirates.
Ex-murderers, rapists and thieves on the sea, as we decided to reclass them.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, they were not very cuddly looking characters, even though they were clearly on much their best behavior.
What did they say? What did they tell you?
I mean, they were at pains to justify themselves. They talked, and many of them were themselves ex-farmers who had been, by their telling at least, displaced from their land by climate-induced stresses. Now, it's a very self-serving narrative, so one has to take that with an extreme pinch of salt. But back in 2016, the Bangladeshi government issued an amnesty whereby any pirates who were not explicitly suspected of murder or rape were granted asylum on condition that they lay down their arms. And about 250 or so of these pirates, including the 2 who I met and interviewed, took up this offer. So in theory, these 2 not particularly cuddly, extremely well-behaved for the occasion pirates were not guilty of some of the worst abuses, but I guess neither I nor anybody else would know that for certain.
We've spoken quite a lot about countries in slightly poorer parts of the world where we can imagine that climate change might feed into a plethora of issues that they're facing, particularly for people right at the bottom of the economic ladder. What does climate violence look like in Europe?
It's a good question, not least because it can be tempting to think of this as an exclusively poor country phenomenon. And for the most part, it is so far. Please allow me a sort of brief digression here. When we have climate-related security threats, it's almost always a marriage of climate stresses and poor governance. And it just so happens that most of the most extreme manifestations of climate stress and most of the worst governance is playing out in poor countries. But, that kind of big immortal but, we are slowly seeing kind of signs of, or not just signs, we are beginning to experience instances of climate-related violence within our own countries. So I'm based here in Athens, Greece, and over the past year and a bit, I've had a project working with a women's shelter, with a women's NGO, looking at how extreme heat is contributing to violence against both Greek and refugee women. And the correlation is startling. The kind of early figures that we have suggest a 300 to 400% surge in violence against women in the summer months. Now, there are reasons for that are probably not related to the heat and the heat alone. So, for example, in the summer months, there's often more financial pressure. In the summer months, kids are not in school, which can be an additional stressor. And it's entirely possible that in some instances, it's not that violence is more extreme, it's just that with windows open, violence can be more audible or more visible. However, this reflects a kind of broader series of findings that we're seeing across the Western world. So, yeah, I mean, another instance, recently when Hurricane Beryl struck the Houston, Texas area, NGOs, sort of women's shelters, experienced, I think it was a 300 or perhaps actually even 400% increase in calls. So we have endless instances sort of illustrating this relationship between climate-related extreme weather events, climate-related perils, and violence against women. But it goes well beyond that. Like this, we're still working out precisely how heat, extreme heat, and aggression go with one another. But to give you another stat, in 2022, of the horrifyingly large number of mass shootings in the US, I think it was 320 something, about 280 of them were perpetrated between the months of June and September. We know that protest intensity and possibly protest numbers increase during summer months. We know that food-related unrest in the broadest sense of the word, also increases in summer months in various parts of Europe and North America. And just to give you one last instance here in Greece. So because of extreme drought across almost the entirety of the Mediterranean littoral in the last 5 or 6 years, we've had a roughly 300% increase in the price of olive oil. And this has been most keenly felt in Spain, which is by far the world's largest olive oil producer. And as a direct consequence of that climate-induced drought and the kind of corresponding increase in olive oil prices, there has been an enormous surge in theft of olive oil. I mean, it's just worth the while of these kind of organized gangs to target. And in one instance here in Greece, I visited a kind of large-scale olive farmer near Athens airport who had branches of about a dozen trees lopped off by a gang of thieves in the kind of opportunistic middle of the night swoop. So in kind of various ways, small and increasingly large, this climate-related violence is coming for us. And one final remark on that. It certainly looks as if we are beginning to see some of the kind of more extreme manifestations of climate change that many of our poorer country peers have been experiencing for a few years. Equally, for all the reasons that we know, the quality of governance in parts of the Western world certainly appears to be nosediving. So the more that our own climatic conditions and the more that our own political conditions come to resemble those of poorer countries, the more reasonable it is to assume that we might see bigger manifestations of climate-related violence than we have to date.
How does migration fit into all of this? Obviously, Greece is on the front line of continuing migration waves from the rest of the world. I assume a proportion of those are climate refugees, although I guess it's impossible to know where you stop becoming an economic refugee, political refugee, climate refugee. What did your reporting show up about migration and the growing number of people coming to Europe trying to seek better lives?
So, of course, the vast majority of migrants, whether they're migrating for climate-related reasons or other reasons, stay within their own countries. And I have, insofar as many of these migrants move to cities within their own countries or in adjacent states, that is contributing to some kind of security problem, and I have looked at that. For example, in cities like Baghdad, in cities like Kathmandu, you're having intensifying fights on construction sites between the kind of existing cohort of day laborers, many of whom are now coming up against rural migrants, many of whom lack the skills for any jobs in an urban workplace beyond construction. And that, as a consequence, is contributing to a decrease in wages with all of the complications that can arise from that. So we have a lot of climate-related migration security challenges within poorer or middle-income countries. I haven't looked in depth at the ways in which migration is contributing to climate kind of related disorder within kind of wealthier places. But yeah, there is an argument to be made, likely a strong one, that climate-related migration, along with all of the other manifestations of that phenomenon, is contributing to anti-immigration fervor and knock-on populist-related violence, certainly here in Greece in the past, but most likely elsewhere as well.
Let's zoom out for a bit, because I know you've also written about armies and the effect of climates on weapons depots, arms depots, things like that. What kind of things have you found in your reporting?
So militaries are absolutely central to this story because, on the one hand, they are already being called upon much more frequently than they were in the past to assist with the fallouts from these climate-related disasters. So, for example, in the US, the National Guard is being called out something like 10 times more to help fight wildfires now than it was even 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. In Germany, in Switzerland, in an array of other countries, in an array of other European countries, you've got air forces that are being called upon to bring water up to livestock high in the mountains, whose kind of usual water sources have been parched into nothingness. So we have this broad phenomenon whereby all of these climate-related stresses are imposing a price that often militaries and militaries alone have the capacity to help solve. And there's also a kind of related argument that in this kind of messier, more violent-looking world that climate change is helping to usher in, that we will likely have greater need of militaries down the line for defensive purposes. But at the same time as many of these militaries have a kind of busier in tray, they will struggle to fulfill both the new responsibilities and their core mission for climate-related reasons. So in 2018, the Pentagon released a study stating that about half of all of its facilities, Air Force, Navy, Army, Marines, had sustained some kind of climate-related damage. Norfolk Naval Base in the US, the largest base of its kind on the planet, many of its quays, many of its docks are at least partly submerged for more than half the year. So this is just happening time and time again. Many of the kind of the UK Army's bits of equipment and its peers on the continent and elsewhere have bits of kit that are just not well placed to manage these kind of circumstances that they're up against. I mean, in a few occasions in Iraq, I watched as American and one instance French special forces came pouring out of their Humvees just beyond dripping with sweat at a time when these vehicles had sort of turned into hot boxes in the kind of 45, 48 Celsius outside temperatures. And then one final point here. We know that militaries, which as things stand are exempt from global emission standards, we know that at some point down the line, they're going to have to decarbonize themselves. And that doesn't have to be a bad thing. A lot of the time, fossil fuel convoys, oil convoys in places like Afghanistan and Iraq were extremely exposed, extremely flammable logistical underbelly that cost the US Army in particular possibly hundreds of dead in Iraq alone. But the very idea that kind of militaries are going to be willing or able to decarbonize themselves at a time when they're having to marry up both their core defensive purposes to these new responsibilities, all while potentially being enmeshed in these kind of glorious climate-related culture wars, just seems somehow a bit improbable. So they'll certainly have a starring role in the kind of future climate-related kind of complications, but they're not going to have much fun with it. I spent a fair bit of time, particularly in Iraq, but also in sort of various parts of the ex-Soviet world, looking at how a lot of often quite poorly maintained arsenals and munitions depots operated by, in some instances, militias and non-state armed groups, and in other instances by regular armies, keep on going boom in these more complicated conditions. Now, that seems less likely to happen with the forces of slightly better regimented, better organized militaries, as one mostly finds in the Western world. But last summer, my partner and I were hiking high up in the Greek mountains, and I was perched with my kind of leg on a log, tying my laces. There was this massive boom that kind of almost sent me sort of scurrying up a tree. And what had happened was that kind of some point further down on the lowlands, this sort of nasty wildfire that we'd driven through on our way up into the uplands had spread into a Greek munitions depot, destroying, I think, many millions of dollars worth of bombs and bullets. So yeah, this too might be the kind of phenomenon that our militaries have to contend with in the coming years as well.
Let's try to end on a positive note, which your book does. There are solutions. In fact, you argue that some of the same problems that we're facing can be part of the solutions. How does that work?
It's true. This is the bleak part of a kind of an already bleak kind of climate discussion. But a few key points. So one of them is that very little of this violence is inevitable. And in large part goes back to the point I was making about climate-related violence being a marriage of climate stress and poor governance. So by rushing assistance to many of the most climate-battered countries, many of whom are also experiencing some of the worst climate-related violence, we could likely see off some of this. It's absolutely no coincidence that if you try and map the countries that are most climate affected with those that are most battered by conflict globally, it's mostly one and the same. We're talking Afghanistan, Mali, Yemen, Syria, and an array of other places. And part of that is that in their states of conflict, they're neither well placed, nor in many instances are they actually on the receiving end of any forms of climate assistance. So that needs to change. They need adaptation funding more than anybody else. So adaptation funding is basically providing communities, individuals, nation states with the funds to gird themselves for climate stresses. So this can mean everything from the cash to build seawalls to deal with the consequences of rising oceans, through to more targeted agricultural systems to enable farmers to use seed types that are better suited for the kind of hotter temperatures that they're now up against. Now, some of the solutions are just so big as to be almost trite to suggest. Reality is we need much less corruption, we need much better governance. But yeah, coming out with that as a series of recommendations is enough to get one sort of laughed out of a room. But no, as you said, there is a kind of potential happy thin silver lining to much of that. And that comes under the banner of something called environmental peacebuilding. And the kind of, to simplify greatly, the kind of theory that sort of undergirds this is that shared resource and climate and wider environmental troubles can help to bring together hostile or warring or tense communities and nation states rather than just tearing them apart in a way that they currently are. Now, thus far, this is a practice that seems to have worked much better at a more local level, where we do have quite a few instances where NGOs and aid and humanitarian development agencies have managed to reduce tensions and in some instances, though less provably, prevent violence from flaring up in the first place by putting in place mediation mechanisms, for example, farmers and herders to hash out water access in key parts of the Sahel. We've had instances where just the digging of a few new wells in certain places has prevented villages from in parts of Ethiopia, for example, from duking it out in a way that they previously were. Whether this can actually yield meaningful benefits at a kind of bigger, grander nation state level is uncertain, but this doesn't have to be the kind of near universally negative story that unfortunately it is thus far, and that unfortunately it will likely become to an even greater extent unless we really launch more meaningful climate action.
Thank you so much for joining, Pete. That's Peter Schwartzstein, and his book, The Heat and the Fury, will be out on the 26th of September, published by Footnote Press. You can pre-order it now, and we'll put a link to it in the show notes. That's all for Battle Lines this time. Please join us again next week for more of the Telegraph's best foreign reporting. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from the Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our news, analysis, and dispatches from around the world, subscribe to The Telegraph or sign up to Dispatches, which brings stories from our award-winning correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a live blog on our website where you can follow updates on Israel and Gaza as they come in throughout the day, including insight from contributors to this podcast. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review, as it really helps others find the show. As disinformation is a particular problem during conflict, we are relying on your support more than ever. Battle Lines is part of wider Telegraph foreign coverage in our podcasts. If you're interested in finding out more about the war in Ukraine, you can listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. Battle Lines is produced by David Degahi, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.